3 days ago, I was still standing at what I thought was my husband's grave. The dirt was fresh. The flowers were wilting. And I had spent 6 months learning how to breathe without him. Then the gravedigger touched my arm and said, quietly, like he'd been waiting for the right moment, "That coffin is empty. Don't go home. Go to Unit 16. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there in the cold while everything I believed about my marriage, my family, and the man I buried began to fall apart around me. What I found inside that storage unit didn't just change my life. It rewrote the last 20 years of it. Every Sunday for 6 months, I drove to the same cemetery, parked in the same spot, and walked the same path between the oak trees until I reached the stone with his name on it. Robert Allen Mercer. Beloved husband. Gone at 51. I always brought one thing, whatever was blooming in the yard that week. He never cared much for store-bought flowers. Said they smelled like a waiting room. We were married 24 years. Not a perfect marriage. I want to be honest about that. We argued about money, about his long silences, about the way he could make me feel invisible without saying a single word. But he also made my coffee every morning without being asked. Dark roast, 2 sugars, left on the counter before I was even fully awake. And every Sunday at church, right when the choir started, he would reach over and squeeze my hand. Just once. Just so I knew he was there. When he died, they said it was his heart. Fast and quiet, the way those things sometimes go. And I became the woman who holds everything together, the bills, the house, our granddaughter Lily who was 15 and needed someone to keep standing so she could fall apart. So I stood. And every Sunday, I went back to that grave. I noticed the old man after the 3rd or 4th visit. He worked the grounds, weathered face, slow walk, always somewhere nearby. He never came close. Never spoke. But he watched me every single time. I told myself he was just being respectful. I was wrong about that. It was the coldest Sunday of that whole winter. The kind of cold that gets into your coat before you even step out of the car. I remember pulling my scarf tighter as I walked the path between the oaks, carrying a small bunch of yellow chrysanthemums I'd cut from a pot on the back porch. I knelt at the stone, same as always. Said what I needed to say. Sat with the quiet for a few minutes. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and it was the old man. Closer than he'd ever come before. Hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way people do when they're working up the nerve to say something hard. His eyes were dark and steady, but there was something moving behind them that I couldn't quite name. He leaned down slightly and spoke low and fast, like he was running out of time. That coffin is empty. Don't go home after this. Go to Unit 16 at Clover Storage on Route 9. Don't tell your family you're going. Then he straightened up, put his hat back on, and walked away without looking back. I didn't call after him. I didn't move. I just stood there with those yellow flowers in my hand, staring at the headstone I had picked out myself. The granite I had chosen. The dates I had approved. The name I had loved for 24 years, carved above a box that apparently held nothing. 6 months of Sundays. 6 months of crying in that parking lot before I trusted myself to drive home. 6 months of telling Lily that grief gets lighter, that time helps, that her grandfather was at peace. And now a stranger in a cemetery was telling me none of it was real. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked back to my car. And I did not go home. Clover Storage was about 4 miles east of the cemetery on Route 9. I'd driven past it 100 times without ever once stopping. It was the kind of place you don't notice unless you need it, a long row of orange metal doors behind a chain-link fence, a keypad at the entrance, a small office with a light that was always on. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I got out. Part of me was saying to turn around. That I was a 60-year-old woman standing in a storage facility parking lot in the cold because a stranger at a cemetery had told me to come here. That grief does things to a person's judgment. That I should call my daughter-in-law Sandra and tell her where I was. But I didn't call anyone. I got out of the car. The office attendant looked up the unit number without much interest. Unit 16. I asked who it was registered to, mostly to hear myself say something normal. He turned the screen slightly. Daniel Pruitt. I didn't know that name. I had never heard Robert mention it once in 24 years. The unit had a combination lock. I stood in front of it for a moment, and then, without fully knowing why, I tried the one number I'd never forgotten: month, day, year of our wedding anniversary. It opened. The door rolled up slow and loud in the quiet morning air. It wasn't a full unit. Maybe 10 by 10. A folding chair. A lamp plugged into an orange extension cord. A narrow cot against the far wall with a gray blanket folded at the foot of it. On a card table in the corner sat a stack of legal documents held together with a binder clip, and 2 phones, the cheap kind, prepaid, the kind you buy at a gas station when you don't want anyone to know your number. I picked up the photograph last. It was Robert. Unmistakably Robert, in a blue shirt I recognized, standing next to a woman I had never seen in my life. She looked to be in her 40s. They were not touching. But they were standing the way people stand when they are comfortable with each other. Easy. Familiar. I set it back down. That's when I saw the envelope, propped against the lamp like it had been waiting there for exactly this moment. My name was on the front. Written in Robert's handwriting. The same handwriting that used to leave notes on the coffee maker on mornings he left early. I sat down in that folding chair. And I held the envelope in both hands for a long time before I could make myself open it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on plain white paper. No date at the top. Just my name at the beginning and his at the end. The first line read, "I need you to know I never stopped loving you, even when I became someone you wouldn't recognize." I had to set it down after that. Just for a moment. Just to breathe. He wrote about Gary Pruitt. A business partnership that had started legitimate enough 8 or 9 years back, in commercial real estate. Small deals at first. Then larger ones. Then ones Robert said he didn't fully understand until he was already too deep inside them to walk away clean. Money that wasn't accounted for properly. Properties moved in ways that weren't legal. And Robert's name on enough of the paperwork to make him look like a willing participant. When Robert tried to pull back, Gary made it clear what that would cost. He didn't threaten Robert directly. He mentioned Lily by name. He mentioned the neighborhood we lived in. He mentioned what he was capable of and what he was willing to do to protect himself. Robert wrote that he had 2 choices. Hand over everything we owned and hope Gary left us alone. Or disappear, and from somewhere safe, gather enough evidence to take Gary down for good. He chose to disappear. He wrote that he was sorry. That he knew what he was asking me to carry. That he had watched me for years hold everything together without complaint, and that it destroyed him to add this to my shoulders without my knowledge or my consent. The letter ended mid-thought. Like he had run out of time, or nerve, or both. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Outside, the Sunday morning traffic moved quietly along Route 9 like nothing in the world had changed. When you find out the truth about one thing, your mind goes back and starts checking everything else. That's what happened to me the week after I read Robert's letter. I wasn't sleeping much anyway, so I had plenty of dark, quiet hours to sit with the last 6 months and look at them differently. The way Dennis, Robert's brother, had stopped making eye contact with me sometime around month 2. I'd chalked it up to grief. Men like Dennis didn't know how to sit with someone else's pain, so they just looked away. That's what I told myself. The way certain phone calls went quiet when I walked into a room. The way Sandra, Dennis's wife, had been almost too attentive in those first few weeks, always nearby, always offering to help with paperwork, always asking if I needed anything handled. I had thought that was kindness. Dennis had offered to take over the finances early on. Said I had enough to deal with. Said Robert would have wanted him to step in and help me manage things. I was crying my way through most of February and I let him. I signed what he put in front of me. Estate forms, he said. Standard. Just keeping everything organized. I pulled those documents out of the filing cabinet on a Tuesday night and read every line for the first time. Robert's name had been removed from both joint properties. Our rental house on Claremont and the lot on the edge of town Robert had been holding for years. The signatures were dated 6 weeks after the funeral. Mine was on every page, in ink, looking exactly like I had agreed to all of it. I had agreed to none of it. I called Patricia the next morning. We'd been friends for 30 years and she'd practiced real estate law for most of them. I didn't tell her everything. I gave her the shape of it, a grieving widow, a brother-in-law, documents signed without proper understanding, properties transferred. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago?" When I told her, she said I needed to come in. That what I was describing could constitute fraud. That there was a window to contest it, but that window would not stay open forever. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table where Robert used to drink his coffee. And I thought about the fact that somewhere out there, he was still alive. And he had left me here alone with his brother. I went back to Unit 16 on a Thursday afternoon, when Lily was at school and I had 2 hours I couldn't account for to anyone. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I just knew I hadn't looked carefully enough the first time. I checked the card table, behind the documents, under the cot. That's when I saw it, taped inside the hollow of the cot frame with a strip of electrical tape. A second phone. Smaller than the first ones. And running off a thin solar panel Robert had somehow rigged flat against the bottom corner of the unit's single high window. He had thought about this. He had planned it carefully. Every detail of it. The phone had one contact saved. No name. Just 3 words, "When you're ready." I sat down in that folding chair, and I called it. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. 4. Then someone picked up. And didn't speak. I said his name. Just once, quietly, the way you say something you're not sure you're allowed to say out loud. And Robert said, "I'm here." I had spent 6 months learning to live without that voice. 6 months telling myself it was gone. And hearing it come through that little phone in that cold storage unit broke something open in me that I cannot fully describe even now. But I did not cry. I was past crying. He started talking fast, that he couldn't explain everything yet, that he was close, that he needed just a little more time, that I had to trust him. I let him finish. Then I told him about the documents. About Dennis. About the 2 properties that no longer had his name on them, signed away while I was grieving a death that was never real. I kept my voice level. I had practiced being level. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. It hadn't. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. Something that sounded like shame moving underneath the fear. He said he didn't know. I told him I believed him. I also told him that believing him and forgiving him were 2 very different things, and that I hadn't decided yet which direction I was going. Then I asked him one question. "Are you coming home?" He didn't answer right away. And that pause told me more than anything he could have said. Patricia didn't ask too many questions. That's what 30 years of friendship looks like. She understood I would tell her what she needed to know, and she would work with what I gave her. I gave her the name Gary Pruitt. She came back to me 2 days later with a look on her face I hadn't seen from her before. Careful. Measured. The look of someone who has found something bigger than she expected and is deciding how to hand it to you. Gary Pruitt was not a small problem. He had operated across 4 states over the past 15 years under slightly different business names, always in commercial real estate, always with a partner whose name ended up on the wrong documents at the wrong time. 2 of those partners had relocated quietly. One had declared bankruptcy. And at least one other, Patricia had found buried in a county court filing from 8 years ago, had been reported dead, a death that was later quietly disputed but never fully investigated. Robert was not the first. He was just the most recent. What stopped Patricia cold was something else entirely. The properties Gary had moved through, including ours, had already been flagged. Not by local authorities. By a federal financial crimes unit running a quiet, multi-year investigation into asset transfers and identity fraud across the region. The investigation had a file number. Our address was connected to it. We had been inside something federal without knowing it. That night I sat with that information for a long time. And then something Earl had said came back to me, the way he had waited 6 months before he ever approached me. 6 months of watching. 6 months of Sundays before he finally spoke. I called him. I had found his number through the cemetery office, told them he had left a personal item near my husband's grave. He picked up on the second ring. I asked him directly why he had waited so long. He said there had been a car. Different car each time, but always parked at the far end of the cemetery road on the Sundays I visited. Watching. He didn't know who it belonged to. But he had worked that cemetery for 31 years and he knew the difference between a mourner and someone with another purpose. He had waited until the car stopped coming. I thanked him and sat with the phone in my lap. If Gary's people had been watching that cemetery every Sunday for months, then they had seen my face every single week. They knew exactly who I was. And they knew where I lived. I noticed the drawer first. It was the one in the hallway console table where I keep utility bills and spare keys. I always push it closed completely because it sticks if you don't. It was open 2 inches. I stood there for a moment, telling myself Lily had been looking for something. Telling myself I'd left it that way myself and forgotten. Then I saw the filing cabinet in the small office off the kitchen. I lock that cabinet every night. It is a habit, so automatic I don't even think about it anymore. The lock was not broken. But the drawer was sitting a 1/4 inch open, the way it does when you close it in a hurry without fully engaging the latch. I set my purse down slowly and walked through every room. Nothing was missing. The television was there. My mother's jewelry in the bedroom drawer, untouched. Robert's watch, still in the dish on the dresser where I'd left it because I couldn't bring myself to move it. This was not a robbery. Someone had come into my home looking for something specific. Documents, most likely. The kind that could connect Gary Pruitt to everything Robert had been quietly building a case against. They had gone through my files carefully and left almost no trace, and they had not found what they came for because everything that mattered was still locked inside a storage unit on Route 9 under a dead man's borrowed name. I checked the back bedroom last. The window latch I check every single night before bed was unlatched. That was how they came in. I stood in Lily's doorway for a long time after that, watching her sleep. She was 16 and had already lost her grandfather once. She had no idea she was sleeping 30 feet from where someone had walked through our home in the dark. I went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and called Robert's burner phone. It rang. And rang. And went to nothing. I called twice more. Same result. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. No lights on. Just the sound of the house settling around me and the faint noise of the highway a few blocks over. I had no one I could call. My own family had betrayed me. Robert was unreachable. Patricia could help me with paperwork but not with this. For the first time in all of it, I was truly, completely alone. And I understood that nobody was coming to help me figure this out. It was going to have to be me. He was on my porch at 7:15 in the morning. I saw him through the kitchen window before I answered the door, Earl, in his work coat, holding a manila folder flat against his chest with both hands, the way you carry something you've been trusted with for a long time and don't want to damage. I let him in. Made him coffee without asking. He sat at the kitchen table and set the folder down but kept his hand on top of it, like he wasn't quite ready to let it go yet. He told me Robert had come to him 14 months before the funeral. Not to the cemetery, to Earl's home. Sat in his living room and explained enough of the situation that Earl understood the seriousness of it. Robert had asked him for two things. To watch over the grave so it looked properly maintained and visited. And to watch over me. Robert had told Earl that if he ever believed I was in genuine danger, if anything changed around my routines, around the house, around my Sunday visits, he was to bring me the folder. Earl said he'd seen the car at the cemetery for months and convinced himself it was just Gary's people keeping tabs. But when he drove past my street 2 nights ago and saw an unfamiliar vehicle parked half a block down with no lights on, he decided he had waited long enough. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a notarized affidavit signed by Robert, detailed and specific, outlining every transaction Gary had pushed him into and every threat that followed. Behind it, a copied set of documents, the same ones Robert had been gathering from Unit 16. And a business card for a federal agent with a handwritten case number on the back. At the very bottom was a folded note. No envelope this time. Just a small piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it fully. It said that if I was reading this, he hadn't made it back in time. That he was sorry for all of it. That the one thing he needed me to know, the one thing above everything else, was that every decision he had made, right or wrong, had been made trying to keep Lily and me safe. And then, at the very end, just 7 words. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough sooner. I folded it back up and held it in my hands. Earl sat quietly across from me and didn't try to fill the silence. He was a good man. He had carried that folder for over a year without ever once opening it. Some people show up for you in ways you never expected and couldn't have asked for. Earl was one of those people. I had played that conversation in my head so many times that, by the morning it actually happened, I felt almost calm. Patricia sat beside me at Dennis and Sandra's dining room table, the same table where we'd had Thanksgiving 4 years running, where Robert had carved the turkey and Dennis had told the same bad jokes and Sandra had complained about the stuffing being too dry. I had a recorder running in my jacket pocket. Patricia had the documents in a neat stack in front of her. Dennis came and relaxed. Sandra was already managing the room before she even sat down, asking if we wanted coffee, commenting on the weather. They thought this was a conversation they could control. I let them settle. Then I slid the first document across the table. I didn't say anything. I just watched Dennis look at it. The second document followed. Then the third. Each one showing a transfer, a signature, a date. Each one from the weeks when I had been barely functional with grief and trusting the people around me to tell me what I was signing. Sandra spoke first. Said it had all been done to protect the estate. That with Robert gone there were liabilities, that Dennis had been trying to hold things together, that I hadn't been in any condition to manage it myself. I let her finish. Then I looked at Dennis. I asked him when Gary Pruitt had first contacted him. The room went very still. Dennis looked at the table. Then at Sandra. Then at his own hands. Patricia said nothing. I said nothing. We simply waited. It took about 40 seconds. I counted. He said Gary had come to him 3 weeks after the funeral. Said there were outstanding debts connected to Robert's business dealings that could expose the whole family if they weren't handled quietly. Said if Dennis helped keep things calm and cooperative on our end, Gary would make sure Dennis was taken care of when the properties were settled. Dennis said he thought he was protecting everyone. I asked him if he had believed that when he watched me cry at Robert's grave every Sunday. He didn't answer. Sandra started to speak again and Patricia placed her hand flat on the table, gently but clearly, and Sandra stopped. I gathered the documents back into the folder, stood up, and buttoned my coat. I told Dennis that the federal case was already open, that his confession had just been recorded, and that what happened next was no longer in my hands or his. I didn't slam the door on the way out. People like Dennis expect you to fall apart. The most powerful thing I could do was simply leave. He came on a Tuesday. I didn't know he was coming. No call, no warning. I was in the kitchen folding laundry when I heard the knock, and when I opened the front door he was just standing there on the porch in that old gray coat he'd had for years, the one with the frayed left cuff I had meant to repair a dozen times and never got around to. He was thinner. Older in the face than 7 months should have made him. And he could not look at me directly. Not at first. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I stepped back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. Not in the living room, not somewhere comfortable. The kitchen table, where things in our house had always been dealt with honestly. I had a notepad in front of me with questions I had written down over the previous weeks, not to be dramatic, but because I knew myself well enough to know that if I didn't write them down I would forget half of them in the moment. I asked every single one. He answered all of them. Some answers were hard to hear. Some were harder than I had expected and some were easier. He cried twice. I didn't, not then. I had done my crying already, out at that cemetery, at a grave that held nothing, for a man who was alive the whole time. We sat there for 3 hours. Gary Pruitt was indicted 4 months later on federal charges of fraud, asset manipulation, and identity-based financial crimes across 3 states. The investigation had been building for years and Robert's cooperation from hiding had given them what they needed to move. The properties were restored through the courts. It took time and it cost money we didn't have easily, but Patricia was relentless and the documentation Robert had gathered was thorough enough to make the case straightforward. Dennis did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that because I know it's what people want to hear, and the truth is more complicated. He faced legal consequences, financial ones, and he lost something inside the family that I don't think he fully understood the value of until it was gone. Whether that is enough is not a question I can answer for anyone else. People have asked me since then what I decided about Robert. Whether I forgave him. Whether he came back home in the full sense of the word. I don't answer that question directly. It isn't anybody's business, and it isn't a simple answer anyway. What I will tell you is this. After 3 hours at that kitchen table, after every question had been asked and every answer had been given, I stood up. I walked to the counter. I measured out the coffee, dark roast, the kind we'd always kept in the house. And I made 2 cups. That's all I'll say about it. Some decisions don't have a clean ending. Some marriages don't either. And some women, after everything they've been through, are simply no longer the person who waits quietly for someone else to decide what happens next. I made 2 cups. Whatever came after that was a choice I made with open eyes. And that, for the first time in a very long time, was entirely mine. I never tell these stories to judge the people in them. People do things out of fear, out of greed, out of a love that got twisted somewhere along the way. What I hope is that somewhere in all of it, you find something true, something that helps you make sense of your own life, even a little. If this one did that for you, subscribe and stay a while. And I'd love to know, do you believe Robert when he said he did it to protect her? Tell me in the comments.